At 1:59 a.m. on February 28th, 2026, there were roughly 15,000 cruise ship passengers asleep in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, totally oblivious.
Right. They were completely unaware that in about 60 seconds, their luxury vacations would just, transform into this sprawling hostage crisis.
Absolutely terrifying.
They had no idea that the skies over Tehran were about to start raining toxic black sludge, or that the entire global economy was effectively about to just hit the pause button.
It's honestly one of the most stunningly rapid geopolitical unravelings in modern history. I mean, we went from a tense but seemingly managed diplomatic standoff to a full-scale, multi-domain regional war in the time it takes to, refresh a social media feed.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. So welcome to you, the learner. Our mission for this deep dive is to take a massive, frankly overwhelming stack of real-time intelligence, military reports, economic data regarding the 2026 Iran war, and really just synthesize it into clear, actionable insights for you.
Yeah, we have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We're looking at how a single 2:00 a.m. social media post kicked off this chain reaction that decapitated a regime, unleashed experimental warfare, and caused global oil prices to just absolutely shatter historic records.
And to do this properly, to really get into the weeds, we are drawing on a deeply comprehensive set of sources. So we're looking at extensive tracking of the Strait of Hormuz crisis, the biography of Iran's newly elevated supreme leader, and geopolitical analysis from the Stimson Center and the intelligence firm Special Eurasia.
Plus the environmental stuff, right?
Exactly. We're pulling in environmental reporting on that black rain phenomenon, think tank briefs from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, on the remnants of Iran's nuclear program, and also diplomatic tracking from the China Global South Project.
Now, before we dive into the timeline, I have to share a mandatory impartiality disclaimer with you, the listener. Today's sources contain highly politically charged content and viewpoints spanning multiple international and political spectrums, including actions by the U.S., Israel, Iran, and others. We want to be absolutely clear here. We are not taking any sides, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints or actions of the political figures, militaries, or governments mentioned in these sources. Our sole mission is to impartially report on the content provided and convey the ideas and facts contained in the original source material so you can understand this complex global event.
Because honestly, with a crisis moving this fast, objective analysis of the mechanics and the motivations is literally the only way to cut through the fog of war.
So let's cut through it. Because, how do we get to 2:00 a.m. on February 28th? If we rewind just a few weeks prior, the headlines were entirely about diplomacy. There's supposed to be an off-ramp here. I'm looking at the notes on February 2025 into early 2026, and there are 3 distinct rounds of negotiations happening in Oman and Geneva.
Yeah, there is a highly visible, incredibly tense diplomatic effort going on. I mean, the first major sit-down was in Muscat, Oman. You had U.S. representatives, specifically Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, attempting to negotiate with the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araqi. But the atmosphere was heavily militarized right from the jump. The U.S. delegation purposefully included U.S. Central Command's Admiral Brad Cooper.
Oh, wow. So bringing an admiral to a diplomatic meeting.
Exactly. It was a very pointed, very physical reminder that the USS Lincoln aircraft carrier strike group was sitting just offshore.
Talk about bringing a loaded gun to the negotiating table. But what were they actually trying to hammer out? Because reading through the summaries of these talks, it kind of feels like the two sides weren't even having the same conversation.
They really weren't. The talks stalled immediately over the fundamental scope of the negotiations. Araqi and the Iranian delegation arrived with a very strict mandate, basically saying, we will only discuss the nuclear issue.
Nothing else.
Nothing else. Their proposal, which was backed publicly by the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, Mohammad Eslami, was basically a compromise of dilution.
What does that mean practically?
Well, Iran offered to take its 400-kilogram stockpile of 60% highly enriched uranium and dilute it down in-country. In exchange for doing that and restoring access to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, they wanted full sanctions relief.
Okay, I need to stop you there because the mechanics of this always trip me up, and I think it confuses a lot of people who aren't, nuclear physicists. We hear percentages thrown around all the time, 20%, 60%, 90% enrichment.
Right, the numbers get confusing.
Yeah. Why is Iran offering to dilute a 60% stockpile? Not considered a massive win. Isn't 60% still pretty far away from the 90% you actually need for a weapon?
That is a super common misconception, and it really comes down to the physics of uranium enrichment. The process of enrichment is not linear at all. When you dig uranium out of the ground, it's mostly the isotope U-238, which is totally useless for a nuclear reaction. Less than 1% is U-235, which is the fissile material you actually need. So getting from that natural state of less than 1% up to 20% enrichment requires a massive amount of energy, time, and thousands of centrifuges spinning constantly to separate those isotopes. It is the hardest part of the process by far.
Wait, really? So the initial heavy lifting is just getting to that 20% mark?
Correct. Once you have a stockpile at 20%, getting it to 60% is significantly faster and requires far fewer centrifuges. And once you are at 60%, the leap to 90%, which is weapons grade, is incredibly short.
How short are we talking?
We're talking a matter of weeks, potentially days, if the infrastructure is in place. So when Iran possesses 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, they are sitting right on the precipice of a nuclear breakout.
Wow. Okay, that makes the U.S. position make a lot more sense. Because if the leap from 60 to 90 is that fast, simply diluting it in-country leaves the infrastructure and the know-how completely intact. Like they could just spin those centrifuges back up again whenever they want.
Exactly. Which is why the U.S. demanded a policy of zero enrichment. The American position was that Iran simply could not be trusted to enrich uranium even to 5% for, civilian energy purposes. The U.S. demanded that any existing stockpiles be completely transferred out of the country, physically removed from Iranian soil.
But the nuclear physics was only half the problem, right? Because the U.S. also wanted to tack on all these other geopolitical issues to the exact same deal.
Yeah, it was a massive ask. The U.S. demanded the dismantling of Iran's ballistic missile programs and the complete defunding of its regional proxy networks. So groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen.
Which is basically their entire foreign policy strategy.
Right. And from the Iranian perspective, their missiles and their proxies are their only conventional deterrent against a vastly superior U.S. and Israeli military. Giving those up wasn't a negotiation. To them, it was tantamount to unilateral surrender.
So you have these two immovable objects. They meet in Geneva on February 17th and again on the 26th. There was even a moment where Oman tried to claim a breakthrough, saying Iran agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium.
Yeah, but the definition of stockpile was completely fractured between the two parties. The U.S. meant the material had to be surrendered and shipped out. Iran meant they would just blend it down and keep it in domestic storage.
Semantics.
Huge semantics. By February 27th, you have the U.S. president stating publicly, I say no enrichment, while Arakchi is in front of cameras emphasizing Iran's sovereign right to peaceful nuclear energy. They ostensibly agreed to send technical teams to IAEA headquarters the following Monday to try and map out the logistics of this dilution idea.
But Monday never came.
Yeah.
Because at 2:00 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Saturday, February 28th, the U.S. president bypassed traditional diplomatic channels entirely and announced Operation Epic Fury via a post on Truth Social.
Literally just a post.
Yeah. It's like spending weeks locked in a room negotiating the closing costs on a house, and while the other party is checking the math, you just drive a bulldozer right through the living room.
That is a great way to put it. The pivot from statecraft to massive kinetic bombardment was instantaneous. And it wasn't a unilateral American action either. The U.S. strikes were tightly, intimately coordinated with an Israeli military operation dubbed Operation Roaring Lion.
Let's look at the stated objectives of Epic Fury, because this wasn't a surgical strike on a single rogue facility. This was a sweeping mandate.
The Truth Social post outlined 4 massive military objectives. First, preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Second, the total destruction of its ballistic missile arsenal and production sites. Third, the degradation of its regional proxy networks. And fourth, the annihilation of the Iranian Navy.
But there was a 5th objective, wasn't there? Like one that wasn't about missiles or boats, but about the structure of the country itself.
Yes. Underlying the entire operation was the explicit goal of regime change. The announcement directly addressed the Iranian public, telling Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC personnel, to surrender immediately or face certain death.
Wow.
It told the civilian population that the hour of their liberation had arrived. They were essentially attempting to spark a revolution from the sky.
So how did the U.S. and Israel actually divide the labor for a military campaign of this scale? According to the CSIS report we have, they didn't just fly wing to wing, hitting the exact same targets.
No, they utilized their comparative military advantages. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's subsequent statements indicate that Israel took the point on the decapitation strategy. Israel utilized its intelligence network to focus almost exclusively on targeting the highest echelons of Iranian leadership.
While the U.S. handled the heavy demolition.
Exactly. The U.S. focused on large-scale capability degradation. They went after the massive administrative hubs and the dual-use scientific research facilities. You have to remember the context of Operation Midnight Hammer from June 2025.
Right, the previous conflict.
Yeah, during that conflict, a lot of the deeply buried high-value nuclear targets, like the massive enrichment facilities at Fordo and Natanz, those were already heavily damaged or destroyed.
So what was actually left for the U.S. to hit this time around?
The remnants and the research nodes. Unconfirmed reports detail U.S. strikes annihilating the Iran Atomic Energy Agency headquarters right in Tehran. They targeted the explosive research testing facility at Parchin, which is crucial.
Why is Parchin so crucial?
Because while it isn't where you enrich uranium, it is where you test the conventional explosive triggers required to actually detonate a nuclear warhead. It's the detonator research. They also conducted heavy follow-up strikes at the Isfahan nuclear complex, basically crippling the logistical supply chain of the program.
And this brings us to the profound structural shift inside Iran. Because while the U.S. was leveling research labs, the Israeli decapitation strikes found their marks. They didn't just destroy buildings. They fundamentally shattered the hierarchy of the Iranian state.
They really did. The strikes on that opening night of February 28th resulted in the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And the decapitation campaign continued. Over 2 weeks later, on March 17th, Ali Larijani was also assassinated.
For someone who isn't steeped in Iranian political structures, put those two losses into perspective for us. Who was Larijani, and why does his death matter almost as much as the supreme leaders?
So Ali Khamenei was the ultimate spiritual, political, and military authority. He was the center of gravity. Ali Larijani, on the other hand, was the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. He was the ultimate coordinator.
Okay, the guy running the meetings.
Exactly. The Iranian government is this complex, often contradictory web. You have the hardline clerics, the aggressively militant IRGC, and the more reformist-leaning civilian government led by President Masoud Pezeshkian. Larijani was the veteran pragmatist who kept those three factions communicating. He managed the friction.
So with both of them gone, along with a significant portion of the senior naval and IRGC commanders who died in those initial bombardments, the entire command and control apparatus is just gone.
It created a vacuum of unprecedented proportions. The architecture of the state was decapitated in a matter of days.
And, I mean, nature abhors a vacuum, especially in geopolitics. Who actually steps into that void while the country is actively being bombed?
On March 8th, the Assembly of Experts, which is the body of 88 Islamic clerics responsible for appointing the supreme leader, announced they had held an election. They declared they had unanimously chosen Ali Khamenei's second son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as the third supreme leader of the Islamic Republic.
Wait, unanimously. In the middle of a war, with the government shattered, everyone just happened to perfectly agree.
The official state announcement claimed unanimity, but intelligence reports paint a very different picture. First of all, the physical building where the assembly meets had been destroyed in the strikes, so they had to conduct this vote online.
An online vote for the supreme leader.
Yes. And secondly, at least 8 members of the assembly reportedly boycotted the vote entirely.
Which raises massive questions about legitimacy.
Absolutely. When Ali Khamenei was elected decades ago, there was a period of intense debate, consensus building, and religious vetting. Mujtaba's election was rammed through in a matter of days during an existential crisis. Analysts widely report that the vote was conducted under immense, direct physical pressure from the surviving elements of the IRGC, who desperately needed a figurehead to legitimize their immediate military actions.
Let's look closer at Mojtaba Khamenei, because this is where the story takes a deeply paradoxical turn. He's been referred to as the Shadow Prince. Who is this guy?
So Mojtaba was born in 1969. He is not a charismatic public speaker or a highly visible politician. He joined the IRGC at age 17, fought in the brutal Iran-Iraq War, and then spent the next several decades quietly building a labyrinthine loyalty structure behind the scenes. He is intimately, inextricably tied to the security apparatus. He essentially wielded control over the Basij.
And the Basij is the paramilitary wing, right? The ones responsible for domestic enforcement.
Yes, they are the volunteer militia utilized by the state to enforce morality laws and brutally suppress domestic protests. When you think of the violent crackdowns during the Green Movement in 2009 or the recent protests over the past few years, The Basij are the ones swinging the batons and firing into the crowds. Mujtaba was their silent architect.
So the new religious leader of the country is effectively a military intelligence operator.
Exactly. And he is considered one of the most extreme hardliners among the Iranian principalists, which is the ultra-conservative political faction that believes in a rigid, uncompromising interpretation of the Islamic Revolution. Analysts note he is far more radical than his father ever was.
Give me an example of how that radicalism actually changes policy.
The most glaring example is the nuclear program itself. His father, Ali Khamenei, famously issued a religious fatwa, a ruling declaring that the development and use of nuclear weapons was forbidden under Islam. It was a theological barrier to weaponization. Well, multiple geopolitical analysts believe Mojtaba vehemently opposes that fatwa and is ideologically open to rapidly developing and fielding a nuclear arsenal.
But here's the paradox I really want to explore. We have this ultra-conservative, hardline cleric who preaches revolutionary austerity and resistance against the West. And yet, the financial data shows something completely contradictory.
Oh, the wealth accumulation is staggering and entirely hidden from the Iranian public. A massive investigation by Bloomberg tracked Mojtaba to an expansive offshore financial network. We are talking about high-value, luxury real estate holdings in London and Dubai, and deep, lucrative interests in global shipping and international banking.
How does an isolated, heavily sanctioned regime figurehead move millions of dollars into London real estate without tripping every financial alarm in the West? Like, how is that physically possible?
Through an incredibly sophisticated layering process. It involves a network of shell companies and intermediaries, like the sanctioned Iranian businessman Ali Ansari. They utilized front companies and sympathetic or neutral nations to wash the funds. The reporting also details massive cryptocurrency transfers routed straight into Dubai, bypassing traditional Western banking SWIFT systems entirely.
That's wild.
Yeah, they basically leverage the very decentralized financial technology championed by the West to fund their own survival and enrich their leadership.
It's the ultimate hypocrisy. But the strangest part of this whole leadership transition is that this newly minted, ultra-wealthy, radical supreme leader hasn't actually been seen by anyone.
And this is where the psychological warfare aspect of this conflict becomes apparent. Mojtaba was reportedly physically injured in the initial February 28th airstrikes, the exact same strikes that killed his father. Since his hasty appointment on March 8th, the regime has not produced a single piece of verified video or audio footage of him speaking or acting as the leader.
But didn't state media release photos of him meeting with commanders?
They released photographs, yes, but within hours, independent digital forensics teams, including BBC Verify, analyzed the images and flagged them as almost certainly AI-generated. The lighting anomalies, the structural inconsistencies in the background, it was a complete digital fabrication.
What about the written statements being put out in his name?
They are being read by news anchors on state television. But linguists and regional experts immediately noticed that the statements are riddled with typographical errors and bizarre mistakes in clerical Arabic and Farsi.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, mistakes a highly educated religious scholar would never, ever make.
Which implies he isn't writing them.
Sources inside Tehran strongly suggest these proclamations are simply being drafted by panicked IRGC commanders, stamped with his seal, and shoved out the door to maintain the illusion of a functioning government.
The rumor mill must be spinning out of control. If the leader is a ghost, what is the actual status of his health?
It depends entirely on who you listen to. Some mid-level Iranian officials insist he suffered nothing more than a minor leg injury, claiming he was merely out for a walk on the compound grounds when the munitions hit.
Which sounds incredibly convenient.
Exactly. On the other end of the spectrum, regional intelligence reports claim his condition is dire. They report he suffered life-threatening lacerations to his abdomen and lower extremities, that he has undergone multiple surgeries, and is currently lying in a secure bunker on a ventilator in a semi-comatose state.
I even saw a report involving Russia in the sources.
Yeah, the Kuwaiti newspaper Al Jazeera published a report claiming that Russian President Vladimir Putin, recognizing the catastrophic collapse of his primary Middle Eastern ally, ordered a highly classified secret operation to extract Mojtaba from Tehran and transfer him to a specialized military hospital in Moscow for emergency trauma care.
Incredible.
Whether that is true or just regional disinformation, the result is the exact same.
No.
The supreme authority in Iran is a phantom,
I want to pause here and look at the underlying logic of the American strategy, because we have this incredible analysis from the Stimson Center by Kelly Grieco that aggressively pushes back on the entire premise of epic fury. The U.S. stated goal was regime change. They wanted the Iranian people to rise up, overthrow this shattered government, and take their country back. But Grieco points out a glaring historical flaw in that thinking. Assassinating leaders from the sky almost never causes a democratic revolution. Why did U.S. planners think dropping bombs would neatly collapse the regime into a pro-Western democracy?
Grieco argues that it is a persistent, fatal flaw in the theory of decapitation strikes. Planners often confuse the unpopularity of a regime with the capacity of a population to overthrow it. Grieco uses the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya as the prime counterexample.
Right, because the narrative is always that NATO air power toppled Muammar Gaddafi.
But that narrative completely ignores the reality on the ground. NATO air power did not spontaneously generate a revolution. It provided close air support for a highly organized, heavily armed indigenous rebel military force that had already seized territory and established a command structure. Air power alone cannot reorder the domestic politics of a sovereign nation.
And Iran doesn't have an organized rebel army waiting in the wing.
Precisely. We saw massive, courageous civilian protests in Iran in 2022 and 2025. But protesting civilians with banners are not a mechanized infantry force capable of storming IRGC-fortified bases. Furthermore, there is a well-documented psychological phenomenon known as the rally around the flag effect,
Where when a country is attacked by an outsider, the people close ranks even if they hate their boss.
It is basic human survival psychology. When a foreign adversary is actively dropping high-yield explosives on your capital city, vaporizing your infrastructure, and causing toxic rain to fall on your children, the immediate instinct is not to start a philosophical debate about democratic reform. The instinct is to survive. And survival usually means aligning with whoever is providing local security, which in this case is the remaining elements of the regime.
So instead of a neat, clean regime collapse, the U.S. decapitation strategy effectively just kicked over a hornet's nest.
It decentralized the IRGC. And a decentralized, cornered IRGC is infinitely more dangerous than a structured one. Without Larijani to mediate, without Ali Khamenei to provide strategic restraint, and with Mojtaba either in a coma or in Moscow, you have a fractured military. Individual IRGC units are now operating in the dark, executing pre-war contingency plans on their own initiative.
Wow.
They are fighting a desperate war for regime survival. They have no political incentive to hold anything back, negotiate, or observe traditional rules of engagement.
And that realization forces us to look at how this fractured military actually struck back. Because they didn't just absorb the blows and wait to die, they launched their own massive retaliation, Operation True Promise 4. And what terrifies me about the intelligence reports from Special Eurasia is how radically Iran changed its tactical playbook. They are pushing U.S. and Israeli air defenses to the absolute breaking point.
We are witnessing a terrifying evolution in real-time warfare here. If you look at previous Iranian retaliations like the strikes in early 2024 or 2025, their doctrine relied heavily on high-volume saturation.
Meaning they would just launch hundreds of cheap, slow-moving Shahed drones mixed with older liquid-fueled missiles, hoping in that sheer volume would overwhelm the Iron Dome.
Exactly. It was a strategy of exhaustion. But Special Eurasia notes that in True Promise 4, the IRGC pivoted aggressively. They abandoned the massive, slow swarms. Instead, they utilized smaller, highly concentrated salvos of advanced, precision-guided, solid-fuel, and hypersonic ballistic missiles.
Let's dig into the rocket science here, because the physical differences between these weapons are dictating the entire war. What is the fundamental difference between a liquid-fueled missile and a solid-fueled one like the Iranian Sejil? Why does the state of the fuel suddenly make them so much harder to stop?
It's all about the launch window and volatility. Liquid rocket fuel is incredibly toxic, volatile, and highly corrosive. You cannot store a missile with the liquid fuel already inside it because the fuel will literally eat through the tanks.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so a liquid-fueled missile has to be transported empty, set up on a massive launch pad, and then fueled by a fleet of tanker trucks right before launch.
Which takes hours.
It takes hours, and it creates a massive thermal and visual footprint. U.S. spy satellites and Israeli reconnaissance drones can see the convoy of fueling trucks from space. They have hours of warning to either launch a preemptive airstrike to destroy the missile on the pad or calculate exactly when and where it's going to launch to alert their air defenses.
But solid fuel changes all of that.
Entirely. Solid fuel is essentially a stable, rubbery chemical compound packed directly into the missile casing during manufacturing. It is inert until ignited. This means a solid fuel missile like the Sejil can be loaded onto a mobile launcher driven out of a deeply buried mountain tunnel, elevated and fired in less than 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
There is virtually no warning footprint. Furthermore, advanced solid fuel missiles have the kinetic thrust to alter their trajectories mid-flight, making their final impact point incredibly difficult for defense computers to predict.
And then you add the hypersonic element. The reports mention the Khyber-Shekin missile. What does hypersonic actually mean in a combat scenario?
Hypersonic means the weapon is traveling at least Mach 5 times the speed of sound, usually within the upper atmosphere. In the terminal phase, as it dives toward its target, it is moving so exponentially fast that complex terminal air defense systems, like the Patriot battery or the Iron Dome, have only seconds to detect, track, calculate an intercept trajectory, and fire a countermissile. It compresses the defensive reaction time down to the absolute physical limits of human and computer capability.
And just to make that math even more impossible, they are replacing single explosive warheads with cluster munitions.
Yes. A traditional ballistic missile carries a single, heavy explosive warhead. An interceptor just has to hit that one object. But Iran began deploying cluster warheads on these hypersonics. As the missile re-enters the atmosphere over the target, the nose cone opens and scatters dozens or hundreds of smaller submunitions over a wide area.
So suddenly, the air defense radar isn't tracking one incoming threat, it's tracking 50.
It completely overwhelms the target acquisition radar and exhausts the battery's interceptor supply in seconds. And it is working. These aren't just splashing harmlessly in the Negev desert. The Special Erasure report confirms that these advanced munitions bypassed the defensive umbrellas and landed devastating direct hits on critical strategic infrastructure. They severely damaged the Bazan oil refinery in Haifa, Israel, and landed precise strikes in the immediate vicinity of Ben Gurion International Airport, halting logistics.
It sounds like an unwinnable economic war of attrition in the sky. Let me try to visualize this. It's like you are trying to defend your glass house from someone standing in the street throwing rocks. But the only tool you have to intercept those rocks in midair is a bucket of Rolex watches.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it.
You are throwing a $1 million asset to stop a $50 rock. In this case, the U.S. and Israel are forced to fire a $2 million Arrow 3 or a Taydad interceptor missile to shoot down an Iranian munition that was manufactured for a tiny fraction of that cost.
The Rolex versus rocks analogy perfectly captures the asymmetric financial bleed. Special Eurasia highlighted this as the critical vulnerability for the U.S.-Israeli alliance. The stocks of high-tier exo-atmospheric interceptors, the Arrow 3s for Israel, and the highly sophisticated THAAD and SM-3 missiles for the United States are finite, and they are rapidly declining.
You literally just run out of Rolexes before they run out of rocks.
And replacing them takes years of specialized manufacturing. For the U.S. Department of Defense, this is a strategic nightmare. By expending their global inventory of THAAD interceptors over the Middle East to protect Israel, the U.S. is severely compromising its own strategic deterrence posture in the Indo-Pacific region. If a conflict breaks out over Taiwan, the U.S. won't have the defensive missiles it needs because they've all been fired over Tel Aviv.
But this war isn't just physical missiles exploding over cities. The digital front is completely broken open. We often talk about cyber warfare as this covert, shadowy thing that happens in the background, but in Epic Fury, it was a primary, highly visible weapon.
It was the normalization of offensive cyber tactics integrated directly with kinetic strikes. The U.S. Cyber Command engaged in a massive campaign of what military doctrine calls disruption, disorientation, and confusion.
Let's talk about the assassination of Ali Khamenei. How did they actually track down a supreme leader who was undoubtedly hiding in a fortified, secure location? They didn't just guess which building he was in.
According to deep reporting from the Financial Times, U.S. military intelligence executed a sweeping compromise of Iranian domestic infrastructure. They hacked into the network of civilian traffic cameras spread across Tehran, and they infiltrated the national mobile phone networks.
Wait, they turned the city's own infrastructure into a massive surveillance web.
Exactly. They utilized facial recognition on the traffic cameras and triangulated the mobile phone signals of his aides to pinpoint Khamenei's exact real-time location. They tracked his movements as he met with senior officials, and that data dictated the precise, down to the second timing of the decapitation strike.
And as the strike was incoming, they blinded his security detail.
Simultaneously, Cyber Command executed a localized denial of service attack. They targeted and crashed the mobile phone towers and communication relays immediately surrounding Khamenei's compound. The goal was to ensure his security team's screens went dark, preventing them from receiving any early warning from radar stations about the incoming stealth bombers.
That level of synchronization is terrifying, but they also weaponized the digital space against the civilian population to wage psychological warfare.
Right, yes, and they targeted deeply personal habits to do it. U.S. intelligence hacked into one of the most widely downloaded Islamic prayer applications used by Iranian civilians and military personnel. Millions of people use this app daily for prayer times and Quranic verses.
Yeah.
The U.S. manipulated the app's push notification system. Instead of the call to prayer, millions of phones simultaneously received highly sophisticated anti-regime disinformation.
What were the messages saying?
They pushed messages encouraging mass civil disobedience, but more crucially, they directly targeted the phones of known military and IRGC personnel, encouraging them to desert their posts, sabotage their equipment, and, quote, join the forces of liberation. It was an attempt to rot the military from the inside out using their own cell phones.
But while the digital war was silent, the physical reality on the ground in Iran was creating an environmental catastrophe. I want to bring our focus to the immediate, horrific human toll that is happening right now in Tehran. The environmental reporting from NDTV details a phenomenon known as black rain.
It is a textbook example of how modern warfare inflicts cascading generational damage on a civilian population. During the retaliation cycle on March 7th and 8th, Israeli airstrikes specifically targeted major Iranian economic hubs, including massive oil storage depots and the primary petroleum refinery serving Tehran.
And when you drop high explosives on millions of gallons of crude oil and refined petroleum, you get uncontrollable apocalyptic fires.
You generate gigantic plumes of thick, black, heavily contaminated smoke. This smoke isn't just wood ash, it is a dense cloud of unburned particulate matter and highly volatile chemical vapors pushing up into the lower atmosphere.
And then you add the specific geography of Tehran and the weather.
Geography is destiny here. Tehran is situated in a geographic basin. It is bordered to the north by the massive Alborz mountain range. These mountains act like a physical wall, trapping air currents and creating a localized inversion layer. The thick chemical smoke from the burning refineries couldn't disperse outward or blow away. It was trapped in a bowl directly over the sprawling urban center of 15 million people.
And then the weather front moved in.
A low-pressure system brought dense rain clouds over the city. As the rain fell through this trapped, miles-thick layer of saturated smoke, a horrific chemical reaction occurred in the sky. The falling water droplets acted as scrubbers, absorbing the airborne soot, the unburned hydrocarbons, and the chemical vapors, dragging them all down to the surface.
So what is actually falling on the streets and on the people? It's not just dirty water.
It is a highly toxic, oily sludge. It falls as jet-black droplets that leave permanent, greasy stains on buildings and skin, carrying a suffocating bitter smell of burning petroleum. From a chemical standpoint, the NDTV analysis shows it is loaded with toxic hydrocarbons. Specifically, it contains massive concentrations of benzene, which is a known aggressive human carcinogen.
And it's highly acidic, right?
Because the refineries were burning raw crude, the smoke contained high levels of sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides. When those gases bond with atmospheric H2O, they create literal sulfuric acid and nitric acid. The rain is burning the skin of anyone caught outside.
But the scariest part of the NDTV report was the mention of the forever chemicals. How did those get into the rain?
PFAS, and polyfluoroalkyl substances. When the military strikes hit the refineries, the explosions didn't just ignite the oil. They also likely vaporized the massive vats of industrial fire-retardant foams that are stored on site to fight oil fires. Those foams are made of PFAS. These are called forever chemicals because the carbon-fluorine bonds are so strong, they do not degrade naturally in the environment or in the human body.
So this black rain isn't just causing immediate misery. The skin burns, the eye irritation, the immediate spike in severe respiratory failures in Tehran's hospitals. It's generational poisoning.
The black sludge is soaking into the soil of the surrounding agricultural areas. It is washing into the reservoirs and contaminating the groundwater aquifers. This means the heavy metals, the carcinogens, and the forever chemicals are entering the food chain. They will be present in the crops grown in that soil and the livestock that drink that water for decades to come.
It is an absolute nightmare. But as the skies over Tehran rained acid, the surviving decentralized elements of the IRGC realized they couldn't win a purely defensive war of attrition in the skies. If you can't outshoot your enemy's interceptors, you choke their wallet. And that realization forced them to look at a narrow stretch of water right in their backyard, shifting this from a terrible regional war into a suffocating global crisis.
Which brings us to the weaponization of geography.
Let's set the physical scene for the listener. The Strait of Hormuz. We hear the name constantly, but let's understand the choke point. It is a waterway separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula, specifically Oman and the UAE. At its absolute narrowest point, it is only 21 miles wide. But the actual navigable shipping lanes, the deep water needed for massive tankers, are only 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone.
And through those incredibly narrow unidirectional sea lanes passes roughly 20% of the world's daily liquid oil supply. We are talking over 20 million barrels of oil every single day, along with massive volumes of liquefied natural gas from Qatar. It is the absolute jugular vein of the global energy market, supplying economies from China and India all the way to Europe.
That within hours of the U.S. and Israeli strikes on February 28th, the IRGC moved to sever that vein. They got onto the open VHF marine radio channels and broadcast a blanket warning to all commercial vessels in the region, basically saying passage through the Strait of Hormuz is strictly prohibited. You enter, you are a target.
And they didn't just issue empty threats. The IRGC instantly transformed the waterway into a chaotic kill zone. By March 12th, maritime intelligence had verified 21 separate, confirmed attacks on unarmed commercial merchant ships by Iranian forces.
The specifics of these attacks prove this wasn't just warning shots across the bow. They were hunting these ships. Look at the timeline from the sources. On March 1st, an oil tanker named the Skylight was struck by an anti-ship missile. 2 Indian crew members, including the ship's captain, were killed instantly on the bridge.
They utilized a highly lethal mix of traditional anti-ship missiles, floating sea mines, and explosive drone boats. The MKD Vyom, a bulk carrier, was rammed by a remote-controlled drone boat packed with explosives that detonated directly against its engine room hull, killing a sailor and leaving the ship dead in the water.
And it wasn't just the massive tankers that were targeted. On March 6th, a small commercial tugboat called the Mursafa II was navigating the strait, simply trying to reach and assist another damaged vessel. The IRGC targeted the tugboat with 2 consecutive missiles. The ship was completely obliterated and sunk, leaving its entire crew dead or missing at sea.
What's crucial to understand is that the IRGC didn't just constrain this violence to the 21-mile choke point. They projected this maritime threat across the entire region to prove no one was safe. On March 4th, a massive oil tanker called the Senangol Namibe was struck by a long-range sea drone.
But the Naimi wasn't in the strait. It was anchored off the coast of Kuwait.
Kuwait is at the extreme northern tip of the Persian Gulf, over 500 miles away from the Strait of Hormuz. By striking a ship at anchor 500 miles away, the IRGC sent a terrifying message. The entire Persian Gulf is now a war zone. The strike breached the tanker's hull, causing a massive ecological disaster as crude oil spilled into the northern Gulf.
They also started dumping naval mines, which are indiscriminate killers. The U.S. Navy announced they had intercepted and destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels disguised as fishing dhows.
The physical violence was horrific, but the brilliance, the dark brilliance of the Iranian strategy was that they didn't actually need to sink every ship to close the strait.
This is the nuance I find absolutely fascinating. If you read the diplomatic cables, Iran never officially legally declared a maritime blockade under international law, but it didn't matter. The strait was shut down anyway. How does that happen?
It happens through the concept of the invisible blockade. The strait wasn't closed by the Iranian military alone. It was closed by the cold, hard mathematics of the London insurance market.
Walk me through the mechanics of this, because a ship doesn't just decide to sail. It requires a massive web of financial backing.
For a commercial vessel to legally operate, it requires highly specific layers of insurance. 2 of the most critical are hull and machinery insurance, which covers physical damage to the ship, and protection and indemnity, or P&I insurance. P&I is the big one. It covers massive third-party liabilities, catastrophic oil spill cleanups, wreck removal, and compensation for crew deaths.
And these P&I policies aren't just written by standard insurance companies, right?
No, they are managed by P&I clubs. These are mutual insurance associations formed by ship owners to pool their risk. If a billion-dollar oil spill occurs, the syndicate shares the cost. But these clubs have strict geographic boundaries. When the missile started flying on February 28th, The actuaries in London immediately reclassified the Strait of Hormuz and the entire Persian Gulf as an extreme high-risk war zone.
Which means the premiums skyrocket.
Instantly. War risk premiums, which are calculated as a percentage of the total value of the ship and its cargo, jumped from a standard 0.125% to an exorbitant 0.4% overnight.
Okay, 0.4% sounds small to a layman. What does that actually mean in real dollars for a shipping company?
Let's look at a very large crude carrier, a VLCC. These ships carry 2 million barrels of oil. Between the value of a massive ship itself and the cargo, you are looking at an asset worth hundreds of millions of dollars. An increase to 0.4% translates to an extra $250,000 to $500,000 in non-refundable premium costs just for a single multi-day transit through the strait.
That immediately wipes out the profit margin for the voyage.
But the invisible blockade went even further. On March 5th, facing the reality of burning tankers and dead sailors, the major P&I clubs realized the risk of a catastrophic, multi-billion-dollar spill was too high. They pulled their war risk coverage entirely for the Strait of Hormuz. They refused to underwrite the risk.
And if you don't have P&I insurance, you cannot sail. It's illegal, and no port will let you dock.
Exactly. I like to think of the maritime insurance market as the blood supply of the global economy. If you sever the blood supply at the organ, the ships don't have to be physically destroyed. They just stop functioning. They drop anchor and wait. Furthermore, the high-risk designation gave the labor unions leverage. Merchant sailors were legally granted the right to refuse to sail into the Gulf, and those who did demanded astronomical hazard pay.
So the strait is legally open, but economically it is a ghost town. Tanker traffic dropped to zero. But couldn't the Gulf states just bypass the 21-mile choke point?
They have pipelines, right? They have ports on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula.
They absolutely tried to bypass it, but the math doesn't work, and the IRGC anticipated the move. Saudi Arabia and the UAE possess overland pipelines that pump crude oil westward to the Red Sea, completely avoiding the Persian Gulf. However, those pipelines operate at near maximum capacity during peacetime. They can only divert an additional 3.5 to maybe 5.5 million barrels a day.
Which doesn't even come close to replacing the 20 million barrels trapped inside the Gulf. Not even close. Oman tried to offer an alternative. Oman has massive deep-water ports like Duke and Salalah that sit safely on the Arabian Sea, totally outside the strait. They offered these ports as safe havens to load oil via overland trucking.
But the IRGC didn't let that happen.
No. In early March, long-range Iranian suicide drones bypassed air defenses and slammed directly into the fuel storage tanks at the ports of Duke and Salalah. By attacking the bypass options, Iran forced the insurance actuaries in London to expand the high-risk zone to include the Omani coast as well. They systematically dismantled every alternative route.
But here's where the geopolitics get truly cynical. Amidst all this burning steel and canceled insurance, the strait wasn't actually closed to everyone. The IRGC started playing a massive game of geopolitical favoritism.
It was a masterclass in fracturing international alliances. Iran announced that the strait was closed specifically to vessels associated with the United States, Israel, and their Western allies. But they made highly explicit, very public exceptions. They openly stated that Chinese-flagged and Chinese-owned vessels were guaranteed safe passage. Because China is the single largest purchaser of illicit, sanctioned Iranian crude oil, they fund the regime. Iran was openly rewarding Beijing for its supportive diplomatic stance at the UN and ensuring their own revenue stream didn't dry up completely.
The diplomatic tracking from the China Global South project noted a bizarre phenomenon happening on the open water. A bulk carrier named the Iron Maiden literally changed its automated tracking signal, its AIS from its destination port, to loudly broadcast the words China owner to any Iranian radar operators listening.
They were basically begging not to be shot, and similar exceptions were quickly carved out for Turkish and Indian vessels. By granting safe passage to the BRICS nations and regional allies, Iran ensured that the global south would not unite with the West to forcibly break the blockade. They weaponized the shipping lanes to isolate the United States.
Which triggers an immediate, devastating shockwave. When you freeze 20% of the world's oil and suddenly slice the market into geopolitical factions, the economic ripple effects are catastrophic. And this hits everyone. It hits the listener of this deep dive right in their wallet.
We constantly hear politicians talk about energy security. This crisis stripped that buzzword bare and exposed the fragile, deeply interconnected reality of the global supply chain. The economic impact was brutal and immediate.
Let's look at the numbers. Brent crude is the global benchmark for oil prices. Before this started, it was hovering around normal levels. Within days of the Strait closing, Brent bypassed the psychological barrier of $100 a barrel and peaked at 126.
And that's just the global benchmark. Dubai crude, which is specifically tied to the Middle Eastern supply, exploded. It reached an all-time historical record of $166 a barrel. The market was pricing in the very real fear that the oil in the Gulf might be trapped there for months.
And it wasn't just crude oil. The Strait of Hormuz is the primary exit route for Qatar's massive liquefied natural gas, or LNG, exports.
Consequently, European natural gas prices doubled in a matter of days, hitting 60 euros per megawatt hour. The cost to heat a home or power a factory in Germany skyrocketed overnight. In the United States, the pain hit the pump instantly. In California, where the gas tax is already high and the formulation requirements are strict, gasoline prices smashed through the $5 a gallon mark and kept climbing.
But the pain in the West was nothing compared to the absolute panic in Asia. The sources specifically highlight South Korea as the prime example of this vulnerability.
South Korea is an economic powerhouse built on heavy industry, but they have virtually no domestic energy resources. They import 70% of their total crude oil and up to 30% of their natural gas directly through the Strait of Hormuz.
So when the strait closes, the clock starts ticking on their entire economy. How much time do they have?
Not much. They hold roughly 100 million barrels of crude in strategic reserves. But natural gas is much harder to store. You have to super chill it into a liquid and hold it in massive, specialized thermal tanks. South Korea only possesses about 52 days' worth of LNG storage.
52 days.
If the strait remains closed past that 52-day window, South Korea faces the literal collapse of its electrical grid. We are talking about mandatory industrial shutdowns, rolling blackouts across Seoul, and a massive contraction of their GDP.
So the global community scrambles to react, to stop the bleeding. You have the International Energy Agency, the IEA, stepping in. All 32 member nations unanimously agreed to release 400 million barrels of oil from their emergency strategic reserves.
It sounds like a massive number, 400 million barrels. But you have to contextualize it against global consumption. The world burns over 100 million barrels of oil every single day. That massive emergency release covers roughly 4 days of global demand. It is a temporary Band-Aid slapped onto a severed artery. It momentarily cooled the market, but it solved nothing structurally.
The structural solution requires opening the strait, which means diplomacy or military force. At the UN, they easily passed Resolution 2817 demanding Iran cease attacks and open the waterway. But when it came to actually putting warships in the water to escort the tankers, the Western alliance completely fractured.
The fear of escalation paralyzed the response. France announced a very limited, purely defensive escort mission called Operation Spites, but major European powers, Germany, Italy, Spain, initially flat-out refused to participate in any military escort missions. They were terrified that if a German frigate shot down an Iranian drone, Tehran would declare war on Berlin and launch cyber attacks against European infrastructure.
Even Japan and Australia, stalwarts of the Western alliance, explicitly ruled out sending naval vessels to the Gulf.
Meanwhile, India, recognizing the paralysis of the West, opted for self-preservation. Instead of joining a military coalition, New Delhi used its back channels within the BRICS alliance to quietly negotiate direct deals with Tehran, ensuring their own tankers were granted the exception status to navigate the violence. It was every nation for itself.
And back in the United States, this global economic panic metastasized into a severe constitutional crisis. I want to dive deeply into the Stimson Center's critique by Christopher Preble, because it questions the very legal foundation of this war. How does a U.S. president launch a massive multinational war, causing historic global inflation and shutting down international shipping without ever asking Congress for permission?
That is the crux of the constitutional crisis. Preble breaks down the legal justification or lack thereof for epic fury. Under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, the president serves as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Historically and legally, this grants the president the inherent authority to use military force to repel sudden attacks or address an imminent, undeniable threat to the United States. If missiles are flying toward New York, the president doesn't have to wait for Congress to convene a committee to fire back.
Right, the principle of immediate self-defense.
Right.
But epic fury wasn't self-defense.
Preble argues it was the exact opposite. It was a premeditated, preventive war of choice. The diplomatic negotiations stalled in Geneva, and the administration made a calculated decision to launch a massive, coordinated first strike to achieve regime change and degrade future capabilities. There was no imminent attack being launched by Iran on February 27th.
And because it was preventive, it required congressional approval.
According to the War Powers Resolution and the Constitution, yes, only Congress has the power to declare war. But Congress was completely bypassed. There was no public debate, no classified briefings to leadership prior to the launch, and absolutely no vote. The president ordered the strikes unilaterally at 2 a.m.
And the political timing of this is explosive. This is happening in a U.S. election year. The cost of living and inflation were already the dominant driving issues for voters before the war started.
As analyst Emma Ashford pointed out in the sources, you simply cannot launch a preventive war that shuts down 20% of the world's oil transit and expect your domestic prices to stay stable. The geopolitical action creates direct, painful economic consequences for the voters.
The political backlash from a $5 or $6 gallon of gas caused by a war Congress didn't approve is immense. But instead of de-escalating to calm the markets, the rhetoric just gets hotter.
The escalation loop feeds itself. On March 22nd, facing mounting domestic pressure and a frozen global economy, President Trump escalated the threats further. He publicly warned that if the Strait of Hormuz wasn't completely open to all commercial traffic within 48 hours, the U.S. military would systematically obliterate every remaining power plant and electrical grid in Iran,
driving the entire country back to the Stone Age.
And Iran, acting through the fractured, desperate IRGC, responded by threatening to blindly deploy thousands of naval mines throughout the entire Persian Gulf, ensuring that even if they were destroyed, no one would safely extract a drop of oil for years.
Which brings us to the terrifying precipice where we stand right now. Let's recap the staggering chain of events for our listener, because the speed of this unraveling is hard to comprehend. It started just weeks ago as a stalled diplomatic negotiation over the physics of uranium enrichment.
That diplomatic frustration escalated into a unilateral 2:00 a.m. social media post that launched a massive, coordinated first strike. That strike succeeded in its initial goals, but catastrophically succeeded in decapitating the Iranian regime.
The deaths of Khamenei and Larijani created a massive power vacuum, elevating a radical, unseen shadow prince in Mojtaba Khamenei and completely decentralizing the IRGC. The military lost its leash.
And that fractured, impulsive military abandoned its old tactics. They responded with a highly advanced barrage of solid-fuel hypersonic missiles, cluster munitions, and synchronized cyber warfare, violently exposing the financial and physical limits of U.S. and Israeli air defenses.
While the physical environment of Tehran was decimated by the black rain of toxic forever chemicals, the IRGC moved to weaponize the map itself. They attacked merchant ships, effectively utilizing the London insurance market to enforce an invisible blockade on the Strait of Hormuz,
shutting down 20% of the world's oil supply, sparking a global economic panic, exposing the fragility of Asian energy grids, fracturing Western alliances, and triggering a severe constitutional crisis in the United States over the limits of presidential war powers.
This entire timeline matters to you, the learner, because it is the ultimate undeniable proof of how deeply interconnected our modern world truly is. The illusion of distance is gone. A complex geopolitical decision made at 2:00 a.m. in a Situation Room in Washington, D.C. can literally dictate the price of the groceries on your shelf, the cost of the gas you put in your car, and the fundamental stability of the economy you work in, just a few short weeks later.
And if we connect this entire chaotic timeline back to the original justification for the war, the nuclear program, it raises one final, truly chilling question. We know from the CSIS report that while the U.S. strikes severely damaged the heavy infrastructure, the centrifuges, and the research labs, Iran still physically possesses roughly 400 kilograms of 60% highly enriched uranium.
The material that is just weeks away from becoming weapons grade. It survived the bombing.
It did. But look at the state of the country holding it. The central government is shattered. The supreme authority is a ghost. The IRGC is decentralized, with individual commanders operating autonomously, fighting a desperate war for survival. The economy is in ruins, and the country's top nuclear scientists are scattered to the wind in the chaos of the bombardment.
So wait, who exactly has the keys?
That is the question keeping intelligence agencies awake at night. Who exactly is physically guarding those 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium right now? In a fractured, desperate state, what happens if an unpaid militia commander, a rogue IRGC faction, or a non-state proxy group decides that the easiest way to fund their survival is to quietly sell that material to the highest bidder on the black market?
It is a terrifying thought to end on. We started this deep dive looking for clarity in a murky, fast-moving crisis. And what we found is that the water hasn't cleared up at all. The diplomatic off-ramps are destroyed, the economic fallout is just beginning, and the physical environment is literally toxic. Thank you for joining us as we unpack this incredible timeline. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the underlying mechanics of how these events actually work, and remember that in global geopolitics, the most dangerous actions are often the ones you never see coming. We'll see you next time.